I want to start out with a little story before we get into working with ambivalence. A supervisor said, "Sorry, but next Tuesday doesn't work for me." And then that supervisor did not offer an alternative time. The Department of Health Services practice coach had been trying to reach this particular supervisor for a week. And the coach that was charged with assisting the supervisors to learn and implement a new intervention model had really been worried about this supervisor. And Carrie was typically a pretty quiet person during that initial training session and seemed to slow down embracing that new model in practice exercises. And so, like most supervisors, she's kind of harried by multiple job demands and also a veteran of a lot of different prior initiatives, some of which were very short lived. But the coach knew from conversations with Carrie during that initial training that she remains very committed to the welfare of the children and the families that the department served. So the coach observed a tape of Carrie in practice last week and noted very little use of the intervention model. And so the coach says, "Well, what's going to work for you?" And Carrie says, "I don't know. I'm pretty jammed right now. How about if we push it back another couple weeks?" And so the coach might, at that point, would say, "I can imagine it feels like there's not enough hours in the workday given everything that the department is asking of you, and yet you know that the department requires this training as a priority." They also said that this first meeting must happen within 6 weeks of the training. Unfortunately, we're right at the end of that period, so we can't postpone any longer. Given that, how are we going to get this accomplished? And so she says, "Well, I can't do Tuesday. I think I can spare about 30 minutes on Wednesday morning." So Carrie's like all the participants at an initial training. Um, Carrie received the information, both written and oral, about the timing and the length, which was 45 minutes of that first follow-up meeting. And they also received a follow-up email and a phone call with the same information, and she knew that 45 minutes was the expectation. So the coach might say, "Actually, Carrie, we will need the full 45 minutes." And so Carrie's going to say, "Oh, okay, I know we need to get this done. Can you start early then, say 7:45 a.m. on Wednesday?" And then the coach said, "Yeah, you bet." So while it might be easy to view the supervisor as just simply resistant, we also know that she's committed to providing good quality care for her charges. And at the same time, she's skeptical of any initiatives because in the past they haven't necessarily lasted. And it's probably more helpful to think of her as just ambivalent. So the question here is, if you were the coach in this situation, how would you engage her when you met next Wednesday? So I've talked about ambivalence a little bit before in the previous lessons, um, and I want y'all to recall the definition of motivational interviewing. It's a client-centered directive method for enhancing intrinsic motivation to change by exploring and resolving ambivalence. Merriam-Webster's online dictionary defines ambivalence as simultaneous and contradictory attitudes or feelings, as attraction and repulsion towards an object, person, or action, or a continual fluctuation as between one thing and its opposite, or uncertainty as to which approach to follow. And these definitions really seem apt descriptions of Carrie's situation and mindset. Ambivalence is a really complex concept. Engel and Arkowitz in 2006 devoted an entire book to understanding the dimensions of ambivalence. And despite this complexity and its, centrality in the definition and conceptualization of motivational interviewing, there is surprisingly little direct guidance in motivational interviewing on the different types of strategies that specifically target ambivalence. So perhaps as a result, some motivational interviewer or interviewing practitioners are going to focus on decisional balancing activities like weighing the pros and cons of the status quo and the pros and cons of change, or looking at both to resolve any ambivalence. I know in my groups, that's how I address that, is looking at the pros and cons of staying the same and the pros and cons of changing. But this approach could be problematic because the data suggests that change talk in relation to sustained talk may be an important predictor of when change does and does not occur. So given this finding, Miller and Rolnick have started to move away from techniques like the decisional balance activities that elicit sustained or status quo talk. But it's not prohibited to use the decisional balance activities, but they're noting that they're all probably most useful in a very targeted situation for people. So that's like when clients are early in their readiness and reluctance to discuss change. I've tried to use this before, and I've had clients who had already made that decision and had already moved on from their substance use, and so it wasn't really effective. So how do we explore and resolve the ambivalence beyond that early stage? So the answer is going to flow from what we've already talked about. And even since the earliest writings on motivational interviewing, we have to be directive and selectively elicit and reinforce that change talk. The exploration of sustained talk is limited, and it happens early, and it's done in the context of moving towards change talk. So to kind of explain this a little bit more clearly and plainly, within motivational interviewing, people are going to resolve ambivalence by talking themselves into changing. So in this lesson, we're going to focus on 4 approaches to resolving ambivalence. 1, we're going to use evocative questions, and then picking the flowers, which is like finding and reinforcing the change talk, and then collecting bouquets, which are using summaries, and then contrasting the values and the behaviors. Like we call that value sorting. And then in addition to those 4 approaches, all of the other activities for eliciting change talk are appropriate. So thinking about evocative questions, these queries are going to ask clients to directly identify reasons why they might change. So early in the change process, this method is going to be particularly helpful, though it's not limited to that time frame. The practitioner is going to use the questions to steer the conversation toward the change elements and then away from the sustain factors. And if I go back to Carrie and think about the coach's upcoming meeting with her, some of the examples of the evocative questions might be like, what concerns you now about your current work? What worries you about how your supervisors or your supervisees are working with people? What would you like to see more of in your work with supervisees? In what ways does this new model fit for you? And besides more time, how would you like things to be different in your work with people? And then lastly, how would things be better if you changed? Although we may ask for change talk, that doesn't mean that the client's only going to speak of those things. Because the client is ambivalent, we're going to expect to hear both the change and the sustained talk. And we're going to expect to hear a little bit of neutral language. But we listen for it and then selectively reinforce the elements that are focusing on change. Motivational interviewing practitioners don't give equal weight to all of the different elements. And that's what the clients are already doing. And that's what has allowed them to remain stuck. So what we're going to do is pay attention to the things that the client tells us about possible change. And Miller likens this aspect of motivational interviewing to walking with a client through a garden. We're listening to the client's description of the flowers and then picking only those that have the greatest salience for them. So the picking in this instance is the use of the targeted reflective listening. So in this way, we're going to hear the descriptions of the flowers of lesser value, as well as those that the clients don't like. We provide only limited attention to those elements. So going back to Carrie, we might note her heavy workload, but we don't remain focused on it. So we're going to focus on the required change, which is embracing the new practice model. So a double-sided reflection may work well here and require that we offer back or refer back to the information that we conveyed previously. So this might sound like, I can imagine that it feels like there's not enough hours in the workday given everything that the department asks of you, and yet you know that the department requires this training as a priority. And although that second part of this statement is not really change talk per se, it is the element that focuses on change. So it's going to be an initial step toward the change. And we know that people who are ambivalent are typically pretty well aware that they're stuck. They don't really need our help to know that they've been unable to make the change. What they need help with is moving forward. So as a result, our job may not be complete by just picking the flowers. Clients need our help organizing the material. So after we selectively choose the flowers, we also need to collect these together in bouquets. And these arrangements are going to help the clients to see the types of flowers, the relations between the flowers, and also the elements that are still needed. So summaries are the way that we accomplish this task of providing the bouquets. So there's 3 different types of summaries that we can use. The first is a collecting summary, and this is just where we're gathering together what the client said, keeping the momentum moving forward, and we're showing the clients their most important thoughts on change. It may do this by placing elements in contrast or in relation to each other. Then we have the linking summary, and this is going to add the elements of contrasting the current ideas with those offered in the past or from other sources. And this linking can be used to highlight particular relationships or maybe areas of conflict. And then lastly, we have the transitional summary. And this is going to help the clients not only see the relationships, but also maybe consider additional options or directions. So if we go back to the interaction between the coach and Carrie, the coach is going to offer this linking summary that contrasts the present information with other information that's already been conveyed. And this is not really a traditional transitional summary, but the question is both kind of joining and focused on the first step in changing, which is the meeting. So the coach might say, I can imagine it feels like there's not enough hours in the workday given everything that the department asks of you, and yet you know that the department is requiring this training as a priority. And they also said that this first meeting must happen within 6 weeks of the training. Unfortunately, we're right at the end of that period, so we can't postpone any longer. Given that, how can we get this accomplished? So we're doing the transitional summary and focusing on the thing that needs to be done, the change, which is the meeting. Another approach is to ask more directly about values. Values questions might include queries about what things are most important to clients. So, for example, when you have to make a major decision in your life, what things factor in? And this inquiry can be done through an activity such as using the value card sorts or VCSs. The VCS is going to use a deck of cards that can be sorted into different piles. And the cards can be obtained through the Mint website, which is www.motivationalinterview.org. Alan Zukoff provides a description of how he uses the VCS, and it's based on his observation of Bill Miller demonstrating the techniques with a little bit of modification. So how we do this is we're going to start by asking the clients to sort the cards into 2 different piles, not important and important. And when a lot of cards inevitably end up in the important pile, we want to take a moment to affirm that many things are important to that client. And then note that a lot of us have a lot of values that sometimes come into conflict with each other. And that this is sometimes what makes it hard for us to make important life decisions. And that kind of helps detoxify the client's likely feelings of frustration or anger or disgust with themselves for being stuck so long. Then we want to ask the clients to sort the important cards into important and most important. And we want to make sure that they have no more than 5 in the most important pile. Then we want to have the clients tell in any order what the word on each of the most important values card means to them. And we want to listen empathetically and work to understand the unique meanings that each value holds for the client, and listen for those underlying themes and connections or tensions among them. Then the next step is to ask the client in what ways that they're currently succeeding in living out each of those values. We want to listen empathetically and ask for elaboration, and also ask for examples. And that's going to elicit self-affirming statements, and it kind of gives the therapist an opportunity to offer affirmations there. Then we follow that by asking the clients in what ways they're not currently living out those values as they would fully like to be living them out. Developing this discrepancy this way is really intended to prime the client in favor of change, really broadly speaking. And that's going to require a high level of trust on the part of the client, and has the potential to leave clients feeling worse, at least temporarily. So we want to ask the clients how to target or their target behavior fits with those values, or what effects the target behavior has on their ability to live out those values. So that question might sound like, so how did your substance use interfere with you living out that value? And I might even give some examples of how substance use could interfere with living out the value of being a good parent. And I'll quote a few examples there so that they can understand what I mean by the question. If the clients aren't spontaneously describing any conflicts between the values and the target behavior, maybe we want to ask about these conflicts or these tensions. We want to ask the client, what they would need to do in order to change or in order to live out these values more fully. So this activity is going to permit the client to explore how their current behaviors are fitting in with their important values. And as always, we as practitioners are going to hold ourselves in a non-judgmental position as our clients are exploring the meaning and the implication of a behavior. And at times, this exercise is going to bring in clear relief that, a problem behavior is very low on that person's list of important values, and therefore change is unlikely. It's simply not as important as the other values. And then other times, this exercise is going to illuminate the stark contrast. And Zukoff wisely noted the possibility of shame is real here. So allowing this shame to become the focus may really immobilize the person from changing the behaviors. The target is change. So this is where the practitioner is going to focus. And although practitioners are going to sometimes feel this activity is highly technical and it's complex, it is something that can be done by people learning the MI method. So using instructions and cues are going to help, but the essential elements are these. 1, identify the most important values. 2, ask the client what each value means. 3, inquire about how the client is living out that value. 4, inquire about how the client is not living out this value. And then 5, note the links or any lack of links between the problem behavior and the values. And as always, we want to use our ORs very liberally here.